Welcome to the podcast hosted by timecam.com on how to stay on top of your work.
Hello everyone, this is Kate. I'm back with another episode of the podcast Stay on Top of Your Work. And today my guest is Scott Sehlhorst, Product Management and Strategy Consultant. Scott, I'm happy to have you here. I'm happy you joined me today.
Thank you, Kate. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm humbled and appreciative of the invite. Thank you.
Thank you too. So the first question to you is, could you say a few words about you and what are your professional interests and what do you do?
Sure. So I'm a product management and strategy consultant, and I've been doing that work for I guess about 15 years now. And for the last couple of years, I've really focused in the space of helping companies transform from like a waterfall environment to an agile environment. Right. The very large companies that struggle with the challenges of actually delivering valuable products to market because their structures and processes are getting in their way. They sort of trip over their own feet. And so my focus is helping them get better at putting valuable products into market.
Mm-hmm. And what strategies and methods do you think are good for product management?
Probably the two most important things are to be outside in your framing of your problem and to have a clear and focused strategy from the top. And so if I unpack that a little bit, very many companies and very many engineers, and I'm an engineer by training, so I can say this, sort of get in their head, they imagine something really cool that they can build, and then they'll go and build it, and then they'll try and find somebody to buy it. And then they won't understand why nobody wants this cool thing. And so a lot of companies waste a lot of money building products that nobody wants. So if you start by saying, what's a problem somebody's trying to solve and how might we be able to help them, and use that as an orienting tool, you'll have a much higher chance of success with the products you choose to build. Mm-hmm. And then the focusing area is really particularly evident in large companies, but it can happen even just to an individual, of identifying the particular goal you're trying to pursue. And then in a company, it would be, we're trying to achieve a particular market position. We're trying to really focus on a particular problem for a particular group of customers. And then you sort of run all of the work that you're doing day to day through this lens of, am I doing something that helps me contribute to my goal? Or am I doing something just for the sake of doing something? Or I don't even know why I'm doing it. I'm just doing it. Mm-hmm. So being able to provide that focus, those are the two main points about sort of being effective from a product point of view.
Okay, so how can a company become successful by delivering a good product? How can we create a good product? What should we focus on?
Okay, so you've given me two questions, and I'll sort of roll it back. I think it's very difficult to say, here's how a company will be successful, but you can absolutely say, here's some things that will make you more likely to be successful, or if you don't do them, you'll be very unlikely to succeed. And the first one is around orienting around the customer, right? Making sure that you put a product in market that somebody cares about. In the Agile world and in a product strategy world, we'll talk about products that are valuable, desirable, and feasible. So it's desirable in that your customer wants it. It's valuable in that you actually have a good business case that demonstrates that this is something worth doing. It's feasible in that you have a team and an organization that's capable of executing to do it.
Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking that these days there are many startup companies, and many of them don't achieve success with their product. What mistakes do you think they do, and how to avoid them?
Okay, so in a startup world, and I have to talk for a minute while I sort of orient my brain around it, because lately I've been spending most of my time with very large companies. There's a quote from Justin Kahn that I'll use as an example. Startups mostly don't compete against each other. They compete against no one giving a shit, which is a really concise and sort of challenging way to say, don't build something that nobody needs. And a lot of startups, I don't know, 90%, maybe 1% of startups succeed. And the vast majority of startups are building products or putting services into the market that aren't better than whatever somebody's doing right now. They aren't materially solving a problem. And even if they are measurably solving a problem, there's a couple dynamics. Like if you look at prospect theory and the way people perceive value of their current situation and future imagined situations, generally what people will do is they will overvalue what they already have by as much as a factor of 3, and they will undervalue something you're trying to sell them by as much as a factor of 3. And so that's a 9-time multiplier, and that's sort of the science, the psychology behind why you talk about startups needing to create products that are 10 times better than what's out there already.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you help large companies transform. What lessons did you learn from working with such companies? That maybe tips that you can give to those starting their own business?
Tip. Well, I'll answer those as 2 questions. So the first thing front of mind that really sort of jumped out to me as a lesson, because I'm really focusing on agility at scale. There's like if you look at the Scrum organization and the roles on a Scrum team. So think about small companies. There's no project manager role, but one of my clients made the statement that yes, the project manager role is gone, but the project management work continues. It's just been distributed across different roles. And when I think about really large companies, even the ones that are getting it right, where they struggle is in coordinating work across multiple teams and figuring out, making those trade-offs between recognizing that in a large organization, you've got different leaders with different sets of priorities because each of them is responsible for some portion of the business. And then when those companies are doing something interesting for a customer, it often requires them to coordinate work across organizations, which means you have teams who have differing priorities about the same set of work. It's the number 1 priority for one team, and it might be the number 20 priority for another team. And so coordinating how you're going to execute and reconcile a schedule of delivery across different teams who care about it in different ways is a particularly challenging problem for large companies.
Right, and I think it's actually challenging for everyone to manage a team, because when you manage a product, you also have to manage a team. So how to somehow combine these 2 things together to make a good outcome?
Right. Okay. That's a great question. Thank you. If you think about, there's in the transition from a waterfall world to an agile world, one of the things that changes is your unit of thinking about how you manage work. So in a waterfall world, the unit of work is usually around utilization of a person's time. You look at how many hours per day, how many hours per week are on task or off task, that sort of thing. You build out project plans based on estimates of how many hours it will take an individual to do a job that you've assigned to that person, right? And you do all of that management. In an agile world, you don't do it that way. The sort of the fundamental unit of work is around the team. So you think about the throughput or the capacity of the team to deliver together. And so that transition happens in your thinking space of how you manage and make sure you get the work done.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned also like managing a time. Do you think that time tracking, because Timecamp is a time tracking software, can it be helpful in managing a product? Or maybe it's something that's not really necessary?
Yes, it's. I think you use the information for different reasons. So instead of while from a human resources or an HR point of view, you need to track time often when you're thinking about how you're paying people or how you're contracting with a vendor or something like that. From a product management point of view, and especially with companies that are early in their transition from a waterfall to an agile state, and I would argue even for companies in a waterfall state, one of the first things that the teams who are doing the building needs to be able to do is make and meet commitments. So they need to have some predictability associated with how they're delivering work to the stakeholders on the business side, if you want to think about business and IT, or commitments made to customers. If you're thinking about a direct relationship between, maybe talking about your roadmap and saying this is the product we're going to have in market in the second quarter. And so you need some insights that help you manage the work you're doing in order to be effective at meeting the commitments you've made. And so that predictability comes back to, it's like a feedback loop. If you think about when you break down your goal into a set of work that you're going to do, and you estimate how long it's going to take you to do that work, or how many of your people it's going to, or your teams it's going to take to do that work. So tracking how long it actually took is an important feedback loop to help you get better at making those estimates.
That sounds good. And you said that about transformation of companies from waterfall to agile state. I'd like to ask you, how does it look like, that transformation? Are there any stages or something like that? Can you describe it?
Yeah. So a company I've been working with recently called Leading Agile has a model and a theory of transformation that I find to be very compelling, because there are lots of different ways to do this, and this is an approach that starts out by saying, if you think about where companies often are in the context of their market needs could either be rapidly evolving or fairly stagnant, right? And the organization can value making and meeting commitments, or they can value responding to the changes in those market conditions. So you can think of that almost like a 2x2. And if you start out with companies that are struggling because either their market's rapidly changing or their understanding of their market is rapidly changing, and they've got teams that are built not to respond to change, but they are built to sort of orient around predictability, then you've got a bit of a problem, because when you set up a project, let's say it's going to take a year or two, by the time you get that project delivered, the reasons that you started that project in the first place are not likely to be, or are likely to not be relevant anymore. And it's you can't correct the course of the ship along the way, because your organization's not built to do it. And so you can't immediately effectively go from that kind of a world to something like a lean startup organization at scale. You could absolutely stand up individual team or teams and let them operate like lean startups, where they are adapting and responding to changes in the market as quickly as any startup could. But moving an entire organization that way doesn't work. So you go through a journey, and in this model from Leading Agile, we talk about sort of the first stage is being able to be predictable, right? So making the changes to the organization that allow you to make and meet commitments as the first step. And then that allows you to move down a journey around efficiency and adaptability, where the next thing you would do is start to manage work in smaller batch sizes, because that allows you to put things in market with a greater frequency. It allows you to create options that help the organization make changes more rapidly. The next step is around moving dependencies. So you could have tightly coupled system architectures, tightly coupled business processes, teams that are working that are all working in a shared code base of, say, a mainframe versus distributed systems. All of those different kinds of dependencies are impediments to being able to make changes rapidly. So this next stage in the journey, you look at breaking those impediments in execution that enable you to start making decisions at that faster frequency. And then that moves into being able to distribute some of that decision making and provide some autonomy to the teams that allows them to look more and more like lean startup. And so you can take an organization through that journey. And the framing that I find, part of the framing that I find really compelling for leading Agile is that you can't just go in and teach somebody how to do Scrum or whatever, or Safe or Less or any of the processes. You can't just go in and train them and expect it to work. What you have to do in the organization is create the conditions where those methodologies have a chance to succeed. Because each of them has a set of assumptions and preconditions, whether it's around executive support or organizational capability or levels of skill of the people. There are all these things about your organization that have to be true for any of those methodologies to work. And so the transformation process is around making those conditions that allow it to succeed.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about that transformation, do you think there is any good way to predict the risk that is included in all that transformation? Because I think it's quite challenging.
Yes, I don't know that I know enough to predict the risk of transformation, but from a product management strategy point of view, and this is why this is such a great question, you don't transform just because you want to be able to say that you're Agile instead of Waterfall. But there's some reason that your organization needs to have the capability to respond to market changes better. And so the overarching framing of that risk is one of understanding how your market's evolving. So how your customers and their expectations are changing, and how rapidly your competitors can adapt to customer needs. You know, if your competitors are rapidly outmaneuvering you and iterating with new designs and developing new technology and improving the capabilities of their products, then that's the risk to your business. And so that's the context for driving transformation. It's changing the underlining or the implicit capabilities of your business to compete more effectively. And then with large companies, when we're talking with senior leadership, that conversation makes a ton of sense. There's a struggle because very, very often, and I think the statistics are over 80%, the people doing the work, so think about your software developers on the team writing code, they don't have that appreciation. They're very often just asked to write code because somebody asked them to write code. Or maybe they're writing code because somebody asked them to build a feature and they know that code is the best way to get there. They are almost never thinking that I'm writing this code in order to help us be more competitive and respond to our customers in a way that differentiates our products from the other choices those customers have available. Right? That conversation resonates strategically with the leadership of the company. And we have to have conversations when we're working with these large companies to help the developers and the individuals who are doing the work or organizing, right? Like you think of your line managers or product managers and product owners within the system, to help them orient around that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's switch to the more creative part of the interview. And I'd like to ask you, what inspires you in your work? Do you find any particular things or maybe books that inspire you, or maybe it's something else?
So one of the drives for me is a little bit selfish. If I'm able to help companies create better products, then there are going to be better products in the market for me. Right? Mm-hmm. I'll drive a nicer car that has an instrument panel, and the entertainment system and all that will work better. I'll be able to get in a car and you have cars today that some of the fancier cars, they will, if you adjust the mirrors and your seat, you get it just right. And then when you get out and somebody else drives the car and they adjust it, when you get back in, it'll remember your settings and the car will switch back and forth. Like, that's pretty cool. But what would be really awesome would be if every time I got in any car, so I travel a lot for work and I get a lot of rental cars, whenever I get in one of those rental cars, it should know my settings too. You know, if every car from an auto manufacturer were able to remember and know who I am and adjust to my settings, that would be really pretty cool. And so like that's the kind of thing that when I'm helping companies with product strategy, I would help them figure out if that's something that benefits them. And then they'll make a better product and then I'll get to use it as a consumer. So that's sort of a selfish thing for me.
I don't think it's that selfish. I think it's quite innovative, actually.
Okay. And then I guess sort of the other thing is I really like figuring out the solutions, right? So the engineer in me to these really tricky problems. You know, you have simple problems that are easy to understand but difficult to overcome, and then you have complicated problems that have a lot of moving pieces. But once you get your arms wrapped around them, they're straightforward to solve. And then you have complex problems where things are really interdependent, and you can create a situation where improving one aspect of the reality actually is detrimental to another aspect. And so you have to balance those things out. And those are the kinds of problems that I guess invigorate me intellectually. Like I enjoy really trying to peel back the pieces of these complex and multidisciplinary problems, understanding how the impacts to people culturally and perceptively, making sure that, you know, when we help with transformation, we don't want to create a situation. We want to create a situation where people get greater enrichment and satisfaction from the work that they're doing, because that's the right thing to do. But also from a company's benefit, people who are enriched and enjoy their work do better work. So, you know, we want to help a company be more competitive. We want to help a company be more efficient, and we want to make that reality better for the people. So, you know, sometimes the goals of advancing one goal can undermine the others. So I enjoy solving those kinds of complicated problems.
Mm-hmm. That's a good source of inspiration. Are there any books that you would recommend, or maybe you don't really read books?
Oh no, I read too many, and there's too many to recommend. So I'll throw out a few answers sort of in context. So as a strategy book, there's a book by Richard Rummelt called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And so for people who are trying to figure out how to frame everything that you're doing, right? So as a company or a government or a nonprofit organization, you know, it's sort of your reason for existence sits at the top of that, and then everything that you're doing unpacks underneath that. So Good Strategy, Bad Strategy is a game-changing book for framing that.
Mm-hmm.
If I dive down into sort of something a little bit more actionable, especially for people in smaller companies, I would look at a book like Value Proposition Design, or the classics like 4 Steps to the Epiphany and Inspired by Marty Kagan, that all take sort of a product and business value orientation to thinking about how you're trying to engage with your market in the nearer term, right? So 1 to 3 years, that kind of stuff, or even day to day.
Mm-hmm.
There's another direction. One of the challenges in solving larger problems is getting teams to work together effectively, and it isn't the sort of command and control model like you would imagine in a manufacturing line. And so very often there's a lot of interesting work being done to help tap the creative insights from people. And there's a book called Innovation Games, written by Luke Homan, that provides a lot of sort of workshop and facilitation techniques for bringing people together to solve interesting problems and difficult problems and reach consensus and get on the same page and focus and align. And it just, to me, opens up a lot of compelling ways to approach solving problems.
And I'd like to ask you also, what is the number one rule in your work, in your strategies maybe, that you can't imagine your work without?
The number one thing would have to be value orientation. So, I have this conversation over and over again in different ways and different levels. When you're creating a product, you don't get to define whether or not that product is providing value. Your customer does. Another way to say it is that your customer has a problem that they're trying to solve, and they can talk about how they would measure success at solving that problem. And they might consider using some tools or products to help them solve it. And so your goal is to have them pick your product as part of how they solve their problem. And that framing helps you align towards something that's valuable for them. It gives you a little bit of sort of corporate humility and some perspective that really helps you make better decisions about understanding your competitors too. That's probably my one thing.
Okay. And my last question, which refers to the podcast name, and which is stay on top of your work. How do you stay on top of your work?
It's a struggle for me, just like it's a struggle for everyone else. I'm trying to regularly balance important and urgent, and managing things. So I'm not as rigorous as I could be, like using a Kanban board to manage the flow of activities and break them down. But I do stay fairly goal oriented, and I have almost sort of a sloppy version of the old 43 folders. I know that some things are coming up. I knew that we were going to have this conversation today, and so I had time set aside to make sure that that we could do this effectively. I could be in a quiet space and be thoughtful as we talked. And so a lot of my energies right now are being focused in a way where I'm not really sure which client I'm going to be working with a month from now. Sometimes I'll work with one client for several months in a row. For the last couple of months, it's almost sort of been a week-to-week thing. And so I'm not doing as much long range planning in terms of sort of my day-to-day activities. But then I have these important things that sort of run as a background thread. And I'm gradually building product management practice. I have some ongoing teaching that I do at a couple of product management and master's degree programs. And so thinking about evolving that body of work in the background, I guess I have my own sort of personal parallel to like a proportional investment strategy. So as a company might say, we're going to spend 30% of our energies understanding this new market we're trying to enter, and 40% of our energies really improving the company's ability to be competitive. So fixing bugs, cleaning up legacy code, technical debt, broken windows, improving efficiencies, that sort of thing. And then the remainder of our percentage is focused in some different area. So I have in my head something sort of like that, and I do far more context switching than I probably should.
No, that's fine. Okay, Scott, it was my pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you for coming here. I enjoyed our conversation, and I wish you all the best.
Oh, thank you so much, and to you. And this was really a pleasure for me. And again, thank you so much for the invitation. It's flattering and appreciated.
Thank you, Scott.
This podcast was brought to you by Tancam. You can listen to it on iTunes and SoundCloud. Subscribe to get more content and always stay on top of your work.